My Friend Mo by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. Sometimes there are friendships that have no apparent reason for existence, between people set apart by every circumstance of life, yet so firm in their foundations that they survive conditions that would separate friends of more apparent suitability. My friendship with Mo was one of these. Mo said and believed that we were friends because we needed each other. In the village, he said once, "Me and her is buddies, see? If her gate falls down, I go and fix it. If I get in a tight for money, she helps me if she's got it, and if she ain't got it, she gets it for me. We stick together. You got to stick to the bridge that carries you across." If he had never fixed a gate for me, waving aside any offer of pay, leaving a profitable carpenter's job to do it, for I certainly could not be bothered with the neighbor's stock coming in, could I? If I had never scratched up $1 for him, Mo and I would have been friends. Beyond our admiration of something in each other that might pass for courage, beyond our mutual helpfulness, there was a warm tenderness that made us like just to sit down together on the back steps and talk about the world as we saw it, while 3 or 4 of his boys squatted patiently on their heels, waiting for us to be finished. Sometimes he would wave his arm at them and boom in his deep voice, "You scappers go on and eat oranges now. Me and her ain't half done talking." He introduced himself on my first Christmas day at the creek. He came out with a man named Whitey, and it was a formal Christmas call. I was bustling about cooking Christmas dinner. Some of the family was there, and Mo and Whitey sat on the back step and visited with the men. It was long past the country noon dinner hour, and I grew uneasy as the turkey browned and the squash and potatoes were done, and the hard sauce finished for the plum pudding. I took my outdoor shower and dressed. I delayed, pushing the gravy to the back of the wood range. Mo and Whitey sat on. The turkey was beginning to dry out, and the sauce had stood too long on the oyster cocktails in the icebox. In desperation, I said, "Dinner is ready. Won't you men join us?" According to my bringing up, that was the signal for uninvited guests to be on their way. I found that in rural Florida, to refuse an invitation to a meal, if one is there at the time it is ready, or nearly so, it is to insult hospitality so grievously that the damage can seldom be repaired. Mo and Whitey had of course had their dinner, but to my horror, Mo said, "Thank you, ma'am," led Whitey to the pump stand to wash up, and came in. The family dinner was ruined for me. The intruders were as unhappy as I, but applied themselves with lowered heads and high-lifted elbows to their plates. Whitey was plainly only a follower, and I stole a look at Mo. He was a great burly man with long arms and thick shoulders, slightly hunched from years of labor. His head was massive, and beyond the full line of forehead, the receding hair was shaggy and leonine. There was the look there of a man who might have been a statesman. He had one of the most beautiful speaking voices that I have ever heard. It had the deep resonance of a bass fiddle. He plowed his way through the many-course dinner without comment. When I served the plum pudding that had taken so long to make and decorate, he looked briefly at the blanched almonds and sugared fruits on top, and scraped them to one side, as I should scrape unexpected insects. The dinner had been one of my best, and it seemed to me from the rough worn clothes and the backwoods speech that it must surely have been a little out of the ordinary for these men. My vanity about my cooking is known and pandered to, and it seemed incredible to me that the uninvited guests like these should not only pay me no compliments, but should have put down the choice dishes like so much hay. I said, "You men have just eaten a typical Yankee Christmas dinner. Now tell me, what is the usual cracker Christmas dinner?" Mo lifted his big head and looked at me gravely. "Whatever we can get, ma'am," he said. "Whatever we can get." I should have given the dinner and all my work over it, not to have asked that question. I heard later that in the village Mo described the meal dish by dish. He spoke even of the edible decorations on the plum pudding that he rejected. "A meal like that," I was told he said. "A feller I don't know what's cold-out rations and what fancy fixin's. When I seed her face, I knowed I ought to have run the risk and ate everything. I do not remember when we became friends. The occasion is bound to have been one when he did me some kindness. It seems to me that there was the hot Sunday morning when he passed by with his boys from a night's frog hunting and found me in hell. I shall always associate my conception of hell with hot Sunday summer mornings at the creek. And why Sunday morning? Because that is when the drinking portion of the help fails to arrive. The Sunday morning that Mo stopped by was one of these. I was without household help at the time, and I slept late without hearing a sound on the place to disturb me. The lowing of the cow finally penetrated my sleep, and I awoke in a humid heat of an uneasy sense that all was not well. I dressed and went out to the stillness of a desert island. I do not remember which of the procession of men was the culprit, but whoever he was not there. The cow was old Laura, weather-beaten, gray, and gaunt, and the only cow I have ever known with a more evil nature than hers is her daughter Dora. Laura was busily and angrily engaged in tearing down the pasture fence. An early daughter, then a calf, little Atrocia, a repulsive creature whom I later traded for a week's hoeing, was jumping back and forth through the hole in the fence that Laura had begun. The young bull had broken through the fence by the road, and at sight of me began bellowing and pawing at the earth. The chickens, unfed and protesting, got under my feet and tripped me as I made my way through the sand spurs to the pasture gate. It had been fastened with an intricate African arrangement of chains, and by the time I had them loosened and the gate swung wide, Laura had knocked down 2 more fence posts and was making her way loftily to the barn. She decided then to be coy, and food being what I suppose she wanted, refused to go into the pen where it waited. She gamboled like a heifer through the grove, her bony hips heaving, little Atrocia at her heels, in delight at the sudden friskiness of her aged parent. I was obliged to give up getting her into the pen. I lugged the feed trough out into the open by the barn and brought a bucket of water, for the lake was low beside the pasture and the stock must be watered by hand. I went into the barn for feed. A new sack had to be opened, and I bruised my fingers working at the chain-stitched binding. I took a bucket of the feed and emptied it into the trough. Laura was in front of the house eating blue pumpkin blossoms and asparagus fern. I climbed up the rickety ladder to the hayloft to pitch down hay, for the bull must have some of this too. A chicken snake and 2 rats ran across my feet as I lifted a forkful. A leather-winged bat, disturbed from its slumbers in the rafters, swooped out of the loft, brushing my hair. A setting hen under the hay flew into my face and floated to earth, squawking and shrilling. I pitched down the hay and descended the ladder. The next to the last rung broke under me, and I slid to the ground and walked limping to the feed trough. Laura had come, eaten all the feed, and was now over by the tenant house. Being full, she had no intention of standing for milking. She had a greedy nature, and I lured her back to the trough with another bucket of feed. The calf was only 2 months old, though weaned, and Laura's bag in mid-morning was full and tight. I had never milked in my life. I had never expected to milk in my life. I should not have tried it now, but I was certain Laura would burst if she were not somehow relieved. I knelt down beside her, put the milk bucket under her, and tightened my fingers around 2 of the teats. Nothing happened. With her mouth dripping feed, Laura turned her head over her shoulder and looked at me as though to say, "What on earth are you doing?" In annoyance, she moved a foot to the side. I moved too. I began again, constricted, desperately trying to recall the motion I had seen the milkers use. The knack suddenly came to me, and I saw the first thin streams of milk drop into the bucket as though I had brought up pearls from the sea. By this time the second bucket of feed was gone. Laura walked off, and I was obliged to go for a 3rd bucket and lure her back again. She was indifferent, but she had become also a little lethargic, and I got her back to the trough. This time, because she ate so slowly, I got a quart of milk. A sense of proud competence filled me. I was dripping with perspiration and flies hummed around us when they stung me. I went frantically on with my milking. When they stung Laura, she switched her long tail across my face. Now she stood, immobile, ruminating placidly. With no provocation at all, because the stinking flies were on me, she lifted a hind foot and kicked the bucket of milk into my lap. I looked at her bag. It seemed as full as ever. I went back to the milking. Humanitarian motives had left me, but I did not want a good-milked cow to swell up and die. I got another pint, and Laura lifted a hind leg and kicked me square in the middle. There was only one thing left to do. I kicked her in the middle, said to her, "You may burst for all of me," and she stalked off into the coffee weed. I tottered to the pen to close the gate. It was at this moment that Mo and his boys drew up by the fence and hailed me. His big voice boomed out, "What you doing with the milk bucket?" I leaned weakly on the fence to answer him. My man didn't show up, and I tried to milk the cow. "Where is she?" He was already putting his long legs out of the old car. His boys tumbled out behind him. "Over there in the coffee weed. I hope she pops wide open." I must have begun then to know him as a friend, for he did not laugh. He gave directions to the boys, and they scattered to the points of the compass. 2 of them drove back the cow. 2 made a noose of rope from the barn. All together they held her tight to an orange tree while Mo rested his heels and milked and stripped her. "What else you got around here ain't done?" The chickens had not been fed, and the water for all the animals had not been pumped. They did that. Mo said, "Now if that man don't show up by evening, you let me know. I'll go find him and take a whip to him, leaving you like this." He was always indignant when he found me doing work that he considered too difficult and too heavy, and called his boys in a swarm to take over. They were silent, unsmiling youngsters, undersized and pale. They went to school passively, and since they showed no interest in education, Mo was trying to train them in his own profession of carpentering and was teaching them frog hunting on the side. "Them Scapers is the best frog hunters in the county," he said. "No fear of them or their mammy starving when I'm done for, long as they can haul in 100 pounds of frogs of a night." The boy smiled, then wanly. The irresponsible night hunting was to their taste. I am sure the carpentering was not, though they did an accurate enough work under Mo's critical eye. Mo's true love was an orange grove, and he would have liked to raise oranges for a living. His father, and his grandfather before him, had been superintendent for the Fairbanks Grove, one of the oldest Florida groves, of which my choice 7 acres in Big Hammock is a part. Mo had lived on the grove as a boy. One day I heard his voice giving orders at the gate. The boys were bringing in a bedstead. It was handmade, spool-turned of pine, put together with wooden pegs. It had the grace of all good handmade things. "This might seem like pure trash to you," Mo said, and the boys set down the bed in front of me, "but if you want it, it's yours. It was made for Major Fairbanks, and before he died, he give it to my daddy. It's been out in the barn for 50 years. You want it?" The bed had real value as Floridian. There are almost no native Florida antiques. Major Fairbanks was not only a famous elderly grove owner, but the founder of the first president of Florida Historical Society and the author of Fairbanks' History of Florida and the History of Antiquities of St. Augustine, both now collector's items. I said, "It's beautiful, Mo, but it's valuable. You should keep it." "We got no use for it," he said contemptuously, not of the bed, but of the household's way of life, which grieved him. "The way I got to figuring, a thing belongs to be used and used right, and if you living nice and having a piece of the mayor's old grove, why, you're the one to have it. Been laying up all these years waiting for the right person. The bed is now my own, and is promised when I am done with it to the Historical Society. I did not understand it at the time, but as I look back on our friendship, I believe that Mo lived vicariously in my grove and in my livin' nice. He was intrigued with every detail of my housekeeping. He put in a new kitchen floor for me, saying of the old one through which he had scrubbed a hole. "Why, ma'am, they was places could a throwed a dog through it." As he worked, he noticed a row of glass jars of huckleberries that I had canned. His grave face brightened. "Now that's a way to live," he said. "All the good things we got here in Florida, blueberries and blackberries and beans and cow peas, all of them things had ought to be canned and put up on a clean cupboard shelf with white paper on it. That's the way my ma did. She lived fine. Not the way you live, but just as good when we had to canning things and keeping things clean." His face darkened. "I've tried and I've done tried to get my wife to do that away, but it just ain't no use. One time I bought 24 glass jars, and I went out by myself and picked about a bushel of blackberries, and I went to the store and bought a 25-pound sack of sugar, and I taken it home and I said, 'Wife, here's a bait of blackberries to put up for us for jam and jelly for the winter.'" He hesitated, his loyalty pricking him. "She probably didn't have the time to do it," I suggested. "She had the time. She let the blackberries spoil, and the antsies got in the water, and I found the jars throwed out in the backyard." I had light on the matter when I met his mother, who came to visit in the village. Mo brought her out and left her with me for the day. She was of the admirable Florida pioneer type, plump, immaculate, wise, and kindly. We talked of her life on the Fairbanks Grove, and we talked of Mo. "It like to kill me when he married," she said. "Mo did love being to home and having nice things. I said to him, 'Son, don't you marry that girl. She ain't your kind, and she'll not make you the home you want.' He looked kind of sorrowful when he said real slow, 'I know, Ma, but I love the little old thing.'" Mo followed the fortunes of my grove as closely as if it had been his own. When I planted 10 acres of Valencias across the road where the dingy pecan trees had been cut down and the vacant space had stared at me, he rejoiced with me. We were sure that the new 10 acres would make the needed difference between profit and loss. I had put my last hundreds of dollars in the planting and was obliged to watch my simple grocery supplies in consequence. I went to the Everglades in the winter on a hunting trip with Desi and the Chanceys. The weather in late November was warm when we left Tampa. Cold weather set in the second day at camp. Even so far south, we were obliged to have a roaring campfire night and morning, and the pond water in which we bathed struck us with icy power. We wore sweaters under our hunting clothes, and were hard put to it as we stood motionless in our deer and turkey stands, not to stamp our feet and clap our hands to keep our circulation moving against the cold. The hunt and the companions were so delightful that I did not think to associate the cold with any menace to my new young grove. When I returned to the creek, I found that a disastrous freeze had come in to the north and central Florida. Old groves showed much damage, fruit was nipped, and many young groves had been frozen to the ground. I looked across the road to my small, frail Valencia trees. A miracle had happened. They had been mounded with earth almost to their tops, and below the frozen tips they were safe. No one could have done this but Mo. That evening I drove into his house to see him. "Bet you was surprised," he chuckled. "The cold had begun coming in that afternoon, and it got worse and worser. I drove out to the creek to tell you something that had ought to be done. You wasn't there, and Martha said you was off hunting in the south, and likely didn't know it was freezing up here. Dogged if I aimed to let them trees freeze behind your back. I got my boys together, and Ivy and Sykes and Whitey and a couple more, and I borrowed all the spades and shovels in Island Grove, and we went out and we worked all night till sunrise. The worst cold come in about day, and by that time we had the job done. Such things that Mo did for me could never be paid for. He tried me out a little later. He came out one evening with the boys and sat stiffly on the veranda. He burst out, "I got to have $40. How about it?" He looked at me in the eye with something like belligerence. I said, "As long as I've got it, it's yours." The loan caught me very short. I wrote out the check as I handed it to the man. I sensed in him a feeling of triumph. He returned the money a week later. I happened to know that he had not worked that week. He was only making certain that he could count on me. After that, he borrowed only when he was in dire straits. Sometimes I myself had to borrow the money when half of his immense family was sick, but my credit was better than his. If he could not pay me back in cash, he paid in work worth twice what he owed me. One summer I decided to make a hurried trip to New York to consult with my editor. I put my car in storage and bought my ticket for New York. My Grove man would drive me in the truck to the train at the village stop. The morning that I was to leave, Mo drove out to see me. His face was gray. He said, "I'm in trouble. Mary's dying. Seems like I've turned to stone. I can't think. I can't figure out what to do." Mary was the youngest of his brood of 12, a shy child with a certain brightness of face the others did not possess. I said, "I'll come," and drove the farm truck behind him to his house. The child lay like a crumpled rag doll on her small bed. Her blue eyelids closed, her breathing hoarse and labored. The mother sat nearby in a slovenly incompetence. Mo had taken Mary to the doctor 2 days before, and while there was a chance, he had said, that her illness might pass into pneumonia, there was an equal chance, with proper nursing, of no danger at all. The pneumonia had developed rapidly, and literally nothing had been done. Mo had been ill and unable to work, and his funds were exhausted. His wife thought the illness was unimportant. The child was plainly in critical condition. A heavy downpour of rain had set in. The roof of the farm truck leaked in like a sieve. I was dressed for my trip and only had 2 hours before train time. But my own plans were trivial before Mo's trouble. I drove to Octola in the train, arranged for a doctor and a nurse, drew money out of the bank for Mo, and went back to tell him that help was on the way. The doctor and nurse had arrived ahead of me and were working over the sick child. Mo looked at my soaked clothes. He dropped down on the porch of his house, and tears ran down the deep furrows of his face. He said, "I hadn't ought to let you do this. I reckon you can't figure why I'd take on so over a young'un, and me with a whole house full of 'em." He wiped away his tears, unashamed, with the back of his big hand. "Mary's different," he said. "All them other young'uns and their ma, they don't pay me a bit of mind. When I come home, times they don't even pass the time of day with me, less'n ask me maybe if I'd bring home meat for supper. They don't none of 'em care, do I come or go. But Mary sets by the road and waits for me. She comes running, and I carry her in over my shoulder. She called me Bubber." The tears ran like rain. I don't know how I'll live if she dies," he said. "I just couldn't make out without Mary." I took my train for New York, but I had almost forgotten why I was going. I could not get Mo out of my mind. All day, far up into Georgia, the rain fell, and they were Mo's tears falling for Mary, the only one who cared whether he came or went. All night the wheels of the train repeated, "Mo and Mary, Mo and Mary." It seemed to me that I should be obliged to get off the train and go back to them. I had a brief interview with my editor and hurried home. Mary was safe. She smiled shyly when Mo took me to her bed. The nurse had the sick room in order, and Mo was in his best bib and tucker. His face was luminous. "I shore went to pieces," he apologized. "When I think of you coming all dressed in your best clothes and sopping wet from helping me, I'm ashamed. But them things gets made up somehow. I'll get a chance to do something for you sometime. Tell you what I'll do. I'll take you alligator hunting. You ain't never been, and I bet you could write a fine story about it if you saw it yourself. Mo continued to keep an eye on my grove, and on tottering fences, leaking roofs, and broken plumbing. He tried to keep his own garden single-handed, and he brought me always the first of his crop, lettuce, squash, watermelons. He brought up the matter of the gator hunt every time he came, but somehow we never got together on it. "How about that gator hunt tonight?" he would say, and I would have some engagement that prevented it. He could not have been much past 50 in age, but he began to break like a man much older. There were increasing periods when he could not do his carpentering, and when he could not go frog hunting with his boys. The last summer of his life he was very ill. He asked if the boys might help with my summer grove pruning. I was glad of the extra labor. At the time Mo owed me $25, and since I knew it fretted him, I asked if he wanted the boys paid applied on the debt. He hesitated. "No, just pay him outright," he said. "There's something between you and me." There was no hope for him. Years of improper food and overwork, of anxiety over the future of his family, above all, I think, despair of not living as he longed to have them live, and had eaten at his big burly frame and great gentle mind. He knew that he was going. He sent the boys out for me one day. He sat propped in a chair, his face gaunt, his hair tousled above the broad forehead. "I ain't gonna make it," he said, and his voice was as deep and rich as ever. "I ain't never taken you on that gator hunt like I promised, and I hate that." A few days later I stopped by his place, drawn by an uneasy instinct. Mo was still propped in his chair. As I stood in the doorway, his breath made a strangling sound in his throat, and the big head dropped forward on his chest and did not lift again. The family stood stonily. Only Mary huddled behind his chair with a desperate small face. Only she and I have missed him, finding the world less generous for his going.